Hi, I'm Cautex, and in my video where I analyzed how many targets are needed for Bladestorm to beat Sweeping Strikes, I got a comment from Lacrin Mex asking when the best time to use Spear Bastion was. When running Elysian Might and Merciless Bonegrinder, they were wondering if it was better to use Spear before Bladestorm or after Bladestorm while they were spamming Whirlwind. Long story short, in this context, it's actually better to use Spear after Bladestorm. So let's go over all the things that I did in order to come up with that answer. Now, originally, I was going to walk through all of the spreadsheet work that I did, but that just bloated the length of this video because ultimately, this sort of question isn't one that is best solved by deterministic modeling. On paper, it was appearing that it would be better to use Spear after Bladestorm, but that was assuming that you could fill the entire Spear duration with Whirlwinds. The issue is that unless you had Wind Fury, it is literally impossible to generate enough rage to do that, even if you started with 100 rage after the Bladestorm. That meant that I would have to mathematically approximate how much rage is likely to be generated so that I could create a reasonable comparison. Doing rage modeling with this type of analysis in Excel requires stacking assumptions on top of assumptions to get a hypothetically expected result based off of averaging out a whole bunch of different things. And really, that just makes it too hard to trust the results. So I had to approach this question from a different angle. Thankfully, there is a way to do really good rage modeling. Simcraft. Unfortunately, getting an answer with Simcraft would require a bunch of APL modifications, which is very much out of my comfort zone. But it is something that I've been meaning to learn, so I figured I might as well just put on my big boy pants and get over my irrational fear of APLs. Now I'm going to be upfront with you. I'm not exactly sure how best to structure this part of the video. Generally, when I make these videos, I like to show that there's no magic behind the curtain. But properly showing and explaining the process that Simcraft uses would take forever and is honestly boring. I tried to find a middle ground, but I'm not sure that I succeeded. So please tell me in the comments if you prefer the more detailed explanations or if you just want me to shut up and tell you the results. Now, unlike in Excel, where I can basically ignore most of the in-game context and analyze specific decisions, Simcraft is attempting to replicate all of the aspects of in-game combat. Because of this, any optimizations made are being done relative to the simulation and not the game itself. This means that it's generally not a great idea to optimize your APLs too much in order to maximize the DPS that you're simming for, because you're not optimizing for reality. To help mitigate this issue, when testing various APL modifications, I would run them through dungeon slice sims and hectic ad cleave simulations. These two fight styles are both AoE simulations, but they simulate the AoE very differently. If a particular modification performs well in both fight styles, then that likely means that it's going to perform well in AoE generally in-game. So let's start out by taking a look at the default APL that Raidbots uses for Arms Warriors in AoE situations, and I'm going to tell you some of the things that I noticed. So if you've never looked at an APL before, when Simcraft is trying to decide what ability to use, it will start at the top of that APL and see if it can do that action. If it can't, then it's going to go to the next line and check it and see if it can do that one. If it can't do that one, then it goes to the next line, and so on. This means that lines that are higher up on the list have a higher priority. This section of the APL is called the HAC, or Hectic Ad Cleave APL, and it activates whenever there are ads present. By default, this APL prioritizes Spear over Bladestorm. Additionally, Whirlwind is the lowest priority, and it has no conditioning on whether or not you're running Merciless Bonegrinder. Also, if you think back on the analysis that I did in the Sweeping Strikes versus Bladestorm video, while I never specifically mentioned it, with Sweeping Strikes, eventually the damage of an Overpower will overtake the damage of a Mortal Strike. Which makes sense because, well, the damage of Mortal Strike is fixed, and the damage of Dreadnought scales as the number of targets increases. Specifically, my spreadsheet was saying that at 3 to 4 targets, Overpower will start doing more damage than Mortal Strike. This APL had no conditioning for such a scenario. With these observations in mind, and my spreadsheets to give suggestions on what might be better, I had to go and try out prioritizing Bladestorm before Spear, increasing the priority of Whirlwind during Merciless Bonegrinder, and prioritizing Overpower over Mortal Strike depending on the number of targets. Now, there really isn't a way of making this process of testing these ideas out seem interesting or exciting because 99% of the time spent doing this was just sitting there waiting for the sims to complete. So let's just cut to the chase and go over the results, and then from there, we can talk about what modifications I made to get the results that I was able to get. The first thing that I did was test my modifications out individually, and all of them were a DPS increase for both Hectic Ad Cleave and Dungeon Slice. So from there, I had to start going through all the various combinations of these modifications. After doing a bunch of iterations of that, for both Hectic Adcleave and Dungeon Slice Sims, my highest performing APL was the one that I was calling Bladestorm is greater than Spear, plus Merciless Bonegrinder Prio at 4+ targets. Now, that also included my overpower priority adjustments as well, despite not being mentioned in the name. This particular set of APL modifications yielded around 5.5% more DPS in Hectic Adcleave Sims, and around 7% more DPS in Dungeon Slice Sims when compared to the default APL. So let's talk about what I changed in the APL with that particular setup to get those results. On the left is the default APL that gets run in raidbots, and then on the right is my modified APL. Starting from the top and working our way down, the first change is that I flipped the positions of Bladestorm and Spear Bastion. Doing this would mean that whenever there was a period where both Spear and Bladestorm were available, the simulation would pick Bladestorm. And by extension, this means that Spear would get used after Bladestorm, which is when you'd have Merciless Bonegrinder up. The next modification that I made was that I added a line just below Spear to use Whirlwind whenever Merciless Bonegrinder was up and there was more than 3 targets. The reason why I limited this line to only be for when there was more than 3 targets is because when I did the math in the Sweeping Strikes vs. Bladestorm video, that showed that when Merciless Bonegrinder was up, when there was 4 targets, Whirlwind would beat Overpower and Mortal Strike during Sweeping Strikes. And simply, it also just simmed better when I added that target conditioning. Finally, just above the line for Mortal Strike, I added a line to use Overpower if 1. You're talented into Dreadnought, 2. Sweeping Strikes is up, and 3. There's greater than 2 targets, which is the same as saying that there's 3 or more. Again, the reason for me adding this line was because it simmed better, and also it lined up with the math that I was showing in my spreadsheet from my last video. So, what's the moral of the story here? If you're running Elysian Might, on paper it seems better to save Spear of Bastion until after you use Bladestorm, so you can get that extra crit damage buff during Merciless Bonegrinder. Something that this analysis cannot capture is the impact of mobs dying early. This ordering of abilities assumes that all of the mobs are surviving through the entire duration of Spear and Merciless Bonegrinder. You will need to make the judgment call as to whether or not you think that the mobs are going to live long enough for you to get full value out of a delayed Spear. If you're not sure, then it's probably better to just err on the side of using Spear before Bladestorm in order to ensure that it gets its full uptime. Now, my modifications to the APL do show promise, but I'm just about positive that they would need to be cleaned up before baking them into the default APLs. There are likely to be further optimizations that can be made to them as well, but those optimizations would of course need to be tempered by the fact that these sims are approximations of reality and don't actually function like in-game combat. As always, tell me why my opinions are dumb. Alternatively, keep asking me interesting questions that I'm able to look into. Lastly, I just want to say thank you for watching this video, and subscribe for more.